If you clicked on this video hoping for a summation of a certain game's mechanical strengths and thematic weaknesses, I'd recommend skipping to the next one. This War of Mine, the board game, developed by Awaken Realms and published by Galacta, may forever be relegated to be the red-headed stepchild of the former's lineup, with other esteemed credentials such as Lords of Hellas, Tainted Grail, and Nemesis taking center stage. Unlike those titles, this War of Mine, the board game, is based on an already established property, its identically named PC game, by 11-Bit Studios, another company of some repute. This video's objective focuses on the intents of all designers involved, from digital to analog, as well as discussing the merits of art in its various expressions. Consider this more an analytical retrospective centered on the environment around the game, inasmuch as the game itself. I know I'm often labeled as being aloof in my writing, prone to wincing skits and offhand cuts, but that would be a disservice to the subject and come off as oddly unsuitable considering this game's subject matter.
This is art. Get it?
Yeah, that's it. That's my only allowed cutaway gag. A brief moment of brevity before tackling the subject at hand. This War of Mine is a depressing, borderline nihilistic adventure. I mean, it's a game, as was its digital progenitor, one you could technically win and certainly lose. It contains rules and impressive production design, so that all checks out. My copy was procured, passed on more appropriately, from a friend in a fashion not dissimilar to the videotape in The Ring or the Pazuzu artifact in The Exorcist. He wanted to badly get this game out of his house, having only played it once and dismissing it as overly difficult and demoralizing, his words. My first play was similarly discouraging. We survived 3 days with no opportunity to climb over the compounding level of negativity and pessimism this game would continually pile on us, so much so that we couldn't even claim the game as being enjoyable. And perhaps that was the point. The book of scripts features coarse language and bleak content, all wrapped in a theme drenched in cynicism and permeated with melancholy, with glimmering moments of pleasure as rare as innocence in combat. This War of Mine, more so with the board game than the video game, brings to question the validity of art when manifested in a form unexpected given modern assumptions.
This is art. Get it?
I said that was my only cutaway. I didn't say I'd only use it once. We've come to accept movies, novels, and music as possessing artistic merit, but inasmuch as a blank canvas, not every expression deserves that label. And even then, much of it deals with personal opinion and consensus. With that caveat, I'll even concede that if you consider something to hold artistic value, what right does anyone have to criticize? I'll continue this analysis with two provisions. 1. That everything contained in this video involves my personal opinions regarding artistic expression, and 2. When in doubt, I will generally confer to the consensus. For example, Tree of Life, art. United Passions, not art. Princes When Doves Cry, art. The Chicken Dance, not art. Quite a long time ago, art was a singular medium and was defined by the expression of an individual. Some years later, it was accepted that a group of people contributing in differing fields could create in totality a single work. To quote someone on the internet, it is a synergy of many arts: music, writing, painting, sound, acting, sets. They are all different forms of art which dance together to celebrate and manufacture hypnotic masterpieces that we call movies. Cinema is magic in service of dreams. Cinema has the power to bend our views and enlighten our mind. But what about video games? That previous statement would certainly apply, except the late Roger Ebert, an individual I idolized before and would after, and to this day, spoke out against this in one of the few circumstances where I felt he was, for lack of a better term, tone deaf. After one of the most substantial and vitriolic fan responses he had ever encountered, Ebert threw down the gauntlet and reaffirmed his stance. One obvious difference between art and games is that you can win a game. It has rules, points, objectives, and an outcome. Ebert also added that if you were to remove these elements, then it would cease to become a game. Those are things you cannot win. You can only experience them. This single concept hounded Ebert for years, even after his death in 2013. To my knowledge, no one, in or out of the field, has ever been able to cite a game worthy of comparison with the great dramaticists, poets, filmmakers, novelists, and composers. That a game can aspire to artistic importance as a visual experience, I accept. But for most games, gamers, video games represent a loss of those precious hours we have available to make ourselves more cultured, civilized, and empathetic. Several criticisms to this idea followed. It's evident that Ebert had a prejudiced vision of what the medium is, or more importantly, what it can be. We can debate what art is, we can debate it forever. If the experience moves you in some way or another, even if it moves your bowels, I think it is worthy of some serious study. That was Clive Barker. More closely to my own experience, Jerry Holkins from Penny Arcade approached the subject with this. If 100 artists create art for 5 years, how could the result not be art? Although I disagreed with Ebert, I felt Jerry's counter and subsequent editorial was muddled at best, offensive at worst. To paraphrase a writer that no one has ever questioned the artistic validity of, Harlan Ellison, another person Jerry Holkins clashed swords with, a million people believing a stupid thing does not change that it's a stupid thing. By the way, after I read the Penny Arcade comic, I wrote Jerry a rebuttal, criticizing what I felt were ad hominem attacks on Ebert himself, and replacing a common sense debate with a confirmation bias. That turned out to be the beginning of an intermittent friendship I value to this day. Just goes to show you that, paraphrasing Edward R. Murrow, that there are still civilized individuals who do not insist upon agreement with political principles as a precondition of conversation or friendship. I don't consider myself an artist. I avoid the label. I don't presume to call myself an author either. I'm a writer, though I do claim artistic integrity from time to time. Even when I ran Dungeons & Dragons sessions weekly from my house, from settings and stories I had conceived from the ground up, I considered them an expression of creativity and believed I was articulating myself artistically in that fashion. It was only recently in reflection on this topic that I started to understand and perhaps agree to a small extent of what Ebert was trying to convey. Art is something without purpose. It must be and can only be an expression of creativity. The moment it serves another purpose, it stops being art in order to serve its other function. A car is not art. It can be pretty, but pretty does not equate art. Employed as a canvas and displayed in a museum, it stops being a car and can be considered artistic. Drive it away, and it stops being art and resumes being a car. Games, including both analog and digital, involve winners, often points, rules, objectives. In the end, it is meant to be played and potentially enjoyed. When a game tries to be a game, it cannot be art. If it peels away the rules, objectives, even the enjoyment, it could be considered art, but would it still be considered a game? There exists interactive art exhibits, but these are not games, and like my automobile comparison, there are numerous games that are beautiful, but that doesn't define art. Some games feature art design, but so do menus. This will generate some blowback, and I invite those comments in hopes of civilized discourse. Like I said, I am not claiming authority on this. I'm only stating that I understand what Ebert was saying and claim that in some way, however small, he may have a point. One of my closest friends is an art major, and one day not long after Ebert's controversy, we spoke at length about the value of his argument and whether or not it had validity, a conversation we still continue to have years later. 4 specific examples have come up for debate. Flower by That Game Company. No, really, they're called That Game Company. Limbo from Playdead, Inside, also from Playdead, and This War of Mine. My art friend believes each one of these games could be considered art, but there were lingering anchors holding each of them back from achieving what she thought at the time was mainstream acceptance, all of these involving around stripping out as much game from the game as possible to undermine what could be considered the enjoyment of winning said game. With Flower, like with many other games, the issue is dragging it back was the inclusion of the aforementioned win state, insisting that if Flower wished to be considered art, then she would change the gameplay. Now each blossoming flower will be fleeting, and no matter how fast the wind swept, you could not finish a level. It just existed. She gave a similar argument regarding Limbo, a title she enjoyed a lot more, but with that one she proposed that the entire game be cyclical. Reach the end, turns out it was the beginning, and you'd have to repeat the whole thing again. You can only escape out by the loop by quitting the game. She was more generous to Inside, specifically with its secret ending where the character you control enters a hidden area believed to be a metaphysical representation of the connection between player and character. By pulling out the plug, you end the game prematurely, a rejection or an embracing of the game's allegory, depending on how you look at it. By severing the connection, you severed yours from the very narrative you were invited to partake in. It would have been funnier if that was the real ending, and not the secret Easter egg you could only find after completing the main game in its entirety. My friend claimed that should have been the real ending, the point of the experience, and not one hidden for only completionists to find. And although I swore I would not sound like a broken record regarding this point, this was her opinion, as this video is mine. Finally, we reach This War of Mine by 11-Bit Studios. It's here where my artist friend and I found agreement. In the game, both digital and analog, a player or players take control of several civilian characters instead of the expected frontline soldiers. They are huddled in a dilapidated and nearly destroyed house, one that we can expect no one there previously owned. The objective is simple: survive until the randomly determined ceasefire. The game is classed as a roguelike, and per that definition, there are elements in the initiation you have control over, but much of the rest of the game is up to chance, including the arrival and length of winter, the locations you can salvage, and the length of the game itself. You can save your progress, but you cannot reverse time. Choices are permanent, including their consequences. But like I said earlier, art must be art. It cannot serve multiple purposes equally. Any secondary functions must be ancillary, even compromised to serve its purpose as art. If you make a concession to add purpose, a reason to exist other than being art, then it stops being art. At some point, when a designer or designers set to make a game, there is rarely a point where it stops being a game. For it to be enjoyable, for it to have a conclusion and objective, it must first be a game, and thus it cannot be art. Entertaining another brief moment of narcissism, this is a role-playing game I wrote. I often take criticism online as I modify the rules as I see fit to conform to the setting. It comes first, the rules second. I wrote a series of novels based on the setting. The game, as illustrated, features segments from the novels. I claim the setting as having artistic integrity, but the game is not art. Perhaps the novel is, as it serves no other purpose other than to be read. But the game? No. Same setting. One is compromised, the other is not. This War of Mine took inspiration from the siege of Sarajevo during the Bosnian War. Something distant and unfamiliar to many watchers, but a subject of painful familiarity for the designers given the distance between their home country and Bosnia is less than the width of my home province of British Columbia. Both variations of the game feature nearly identical aesthetics, approaching their subject matter with little disparity. A flat 2D plane of a house with numerous marks of damage, an encroaching bitter cold that can only be initially fought off by burning part of the very house you have taken residence in. Walking outside in the day would surely result in a sniper kill, forcing scavenging under cover of darkness, the second half of a round, where players must choose what are the most essential items to scavenge. However, it's during these moments where the true heart of the game begins to lie. The house is safe. From within, all you can do is build, repair, and hopefully stave off starvation or illness for another day. The house deals with consequences, the consequences of what occurred the night before. What reprehensible act did the singular selected scavenger carry out to ensure the survival of the rest? What traumas did that one individual endure as payment to live another day? Regardless if they were selfish or committed in a sense of humane urgency, where you decide who are the right people to survive the war, those with a chance or those we'll need later. Be the monster so no one else need be. These are some of the points this War of Mine brings up, and I'll discuss at length later if it succeeds or not, and they're points I'm extensively experienced with. The video game was championed by many critics and outlets for its artistic merit. A game that actually feels like being in a war, they said. This game will make you hate yourself. It was billed as being anti-war, one where you loathe the very environments you would run through obliviously as B.G. Blazkowicz. It brings up a thought I often had in regards to the fictional settings in the world embraces. Would you really want to live there? In most situations, the answer is no, and if you disagree and bring up an example other than Star Trek, I'd argue that you wouldn't be the hero of the narrative. That belongs to the protagonist. You'd be the background nameless civilian, the one caught in the crossfire, whose house is destroyed as collateral. You're the one paying roaming adventurers to clear out the wolves from your farm. You're unlikely to be the hero. Not everyone lives to 95 like Chuck Yeager. In the 1950s, when Chuck was pushing the sound barrier, other test pilots were dying at a rate of 1 per week. Statistically, you're unlikely to be the exception. The issue with this War of Mine, the video game, is that the characters you control are somewhat exceptional. They do possess an outstanding degree of survivability, and despite what you may presume, you are able to survive attacks both physical and mental without any permanent effects. Know that if you can fill one's belly and warm their body for long enough, tend to their wounds in a timely fashion, anyone can make a full recovery in a matter of days. The challenge is creating that safe space, but as my playtime may reveal to you, this is not difficult. Firstly, the video game can be, to use the modern vernacular, cheesed. In a nod to Groundhog Day, if you control Alt out of the game upon discovering a character's demise, you terminate the game and can restart the previous day in hopes of change in the future. A fact you can repeat until the results are satisfying. But even assuming you don't employ that tactic and are simply adept with a mouse click, you can make it out of the early encounters so well equipped as to make much of the rest of the game relaxed. That old couple? You'll get depressed when you rob them, but that'll pass in a day or two, and they have a lot of stuff. Those three girls, one of which is armed, holed up in that apartment? One is eager to put a bullet in your head just for crossing the map without even posing a threat. Hide in their shadows and take them out. Sure, your character will get upset, but you'd have some shiny new weapons to defend the house, and you could then repeat the salvaging run the next day or the next week until you stripped it to the bare basics, securing enough to be almost self-sufficient. Sometimes you'd simply use the game's basic combat mechanics to simply wait, as each corrupt soldier ran out of cover to get shot in the face. Once again, no real long-term effects. In over 100 hours, I only outright failed twice, including my first game, which was also the only time I ever felt any real emotions relating to tension or fear. In another instance, I wasn't able to pull one man out of his depression, no matter how much sleep or food he had, and eventually he walked out from the house, never to return. No bother, as we had a better trained replacement within a few days. And yet the common takeaway from all of these hours of gameplay was that I enjoyed the experience. And this became the ultimate failure as art. To put it simply, 11-bit studios couldn't help themselves. They made a good game. They knew their craft. This wasn't their first title. Anomaly, their previous game, is fantastic. A novel twist on a tried and at that point tiresome concept, carried out with a level of passion and effort undeserving for its genre. So much so that I was amazed that their second game would be adapted to be a board game and not Anomaly. I mean, someone seriously needs to get on this. Anomaly would make a fantastic board game. But to this war of mine, the balance of resource collection and the building of vital equipment, the trading with the conveniently survivable and timely door-to-door merchant, repeating his perfectly cyclical route every 48 to 72 hours. Gain enough, make enough, trade enough, and everyone will be happy. In time, your food supply will be self-sustainable. You'll never worry about fuel or the emotional states of those under your metaphysical ward. You'll erect beds, distill your own alcohol, and even barricade yourself against the most ferocious machinations of male monsters. I truly believe the game becomes aware of this, as when you reach a point of rhythm where tedium begins to set in, the game abruptly ends. Congratulations, you survived the war. Here's a quick overview of what happened in an almost callously abrupt bullet point fashion, and how those horrible choices made during the siege didn't really affect you. Regardless of the choices made, if everyone is happy by game's end, these final stories are more or less the same. Ultimately, the success of the game, the satisfaction in playing it, came at the cost of the empathy one may feel towards these sprites running across our screen. I possessed barely a moment's emotional investment in a character, and despite the background and journal entries, they still became defined by their negotiation skills and how big their backpack was. Send Roman first, he's good with weapons. Send up Boris the next day, the man is an ox and could carry a shed on his back if given the opportunity. Their actual lives became irrelevant, their emotional states trivial, until those brief and rare moments where they would manifest their sadness by briefly stopping their task or walking slower than usual, but that was nothing a few frantic mouse clicks wouldn't fix. Ultimately, until a character was debilitated, either physically or emotionally, their function would rarely be compromised. I was less invested in their happiness as I was for Commander Shepard. But I loved it. 107 hours of love. Its failure as a work of art made it a better game. When discussing how one would alter the game in favor of artistic expression, my friend and I agreed the solution would be to make the game unwinnable. No matter what you do, no matter how you manipulated the system, no matter how violent you became, in your desperation, all you could do was survive another day. In an unending war you had no hopes of seeing the end of. Eventually, you'd run out of food, the attacks would become too severe, there would be nothing left of value to salvage. Eventually, as a player, you'd have no one left to control, and the game would just continue, each day an empty and lifeless house in a nameless wasteland. Like the other examples mentioned earlier, as a player you could still choose to exit out of that reality, but for those contained within it, their fate had been sealed the moment the game began. It's this belief I think the designers of the board game decided to embrace. This is not to claim that Awaken Realms and Galacta are inferior game designers. I mean, that's entirely possible, but I believe that this conversation was had at some point. They looked at the digital version of this war of mine and judged it forgiving, lenient, soft. Those optional diary entries in the video game would become unavoidable. The emotional states of the various characters would be impossible to resist, and outside of outright cheating, there would be no point in the game's running time where tedium or relief would settle in. From the first moment, the board game would push players down and force them to emphasize through graphic narrative depictions the horrors and ordeals of living as civilians in a war zone. As such, the board game suffers from clunky mechanics, mean-spirited limitations, and unforgiving levels of difficulty in an infuriatingly prolonged running length. Designers knew the game had to run shorter than the average 8 to 12 hours the video game would employ, but even at 3+ hours, the board game is a slog, an ordeal of patience. The box promises at most 2 hours of play, but this assumes you lose the game, as a victory will generally take you as much as 5. The box outright lies to you, offering a false sense of security. How many times did players admit defeat simply out of attrition rather than some singular destructive event? My first 2 times playing this game, we gave up before the last character died from simple mental exhaustion. Instead of fixing this problem in development, designers gave you a way to save your progress so you could set up and resume at a later date. A borderline insane solution to a problem any designer would do everything to avoid. At this point, I have to admit that I don't have the answers to the conundrums I'm implying. These and many other issues could in fact be mechanical flaws, short-sighted design. In the end, the video games mentioned before, Flower, Limbo, Inside, and This War of Mine, have all achieved meteoric critical acclaim and high sales, and this is because despite their drive to be taken seriously as art, ultimately they compromise that expression in order to make their games accessible and enjoyable. And obviously it worked. The board game does not make that compromise, and as a result, the game, as a game, suffers. It is stressful to play. It does not lead to a satisfaction and elation. It ultimately ends in a discouraging and draining exhale, like sticking a needle in a whoopee cushion and just letting the air slowly leak out without a fart. The game almost doesn't want to be played, imposing that 3 to 5 hour running length as another detractor as much as anything. You don't feel the moment of euphoria of returning home with a load of supplies to tackle the next day's chores. You had that with the video game. It was addicting. With a save point reserved for each morning, you'd make it to the evening, secure a valuable stash of needed electric parts, supplies, or wood, return back, and you'd immediately want to start working on building that workshop or that water collector, and before you knew it, the day was halfway over. And you'd have to suffer another evening cycle, one where you'd finally snag that needed component required to craft that heat lamp, which you needed to make that herbal garden, best to get on that the next day, and so on. The board game is not as fun. It is, admittedly, not a good game. But by being so, it might have become truer expression of art. Transformative as it may be, which brings up another issue. Can it stand on its own as art despite being adapted? Does the existence of the video game and its presence as a game more than art hold the board game from reaching that lofty perch? On this, I would disagree and claim the board game could still hold its own, retracing a point made some time ago regarding legal precedent. If you transform something adapted enough, it can stand on its own as an original piece. I said legal, as we have YouTube to thank for this, as it became important for them to define what is original despite employing another creator's content. At which point can that work stand on its own? At the beginning of this video, I used a clip from the video's game trailer. I cut portions out, added a subtitle, and replaced the music. Does it stand as transformative, original? I don't think so, but as a total piece it might. It would be difficult to say. The board game took the concept, name, and intention from its progenitor, but then shifted presentation and altered the mechanics. The board game, I have to believe, took the effort to sap the joy out of these experiences. I'll discuss the game's mechanics as I believe I'm obligated to. That's a conceit, by the way, a compromise to add purpose to this video, effectively employing the logic I stressed earlier to define this video as not being art. My loss. The source of most of the story can be found here, the Book of Scripts, containing more narrative segments than I ever encountered in the video game. Near and Far is credited for its extensive storybook featuring close to 300 story entries. This War of Mine, the board game, boasts nearly 2,000. Small font, no artwork, as antiseptic as the rest of the game. And what barely passes off as faint praise, the designers attempted to make learning the actual game as stress-free as possible. Alas, their inspiration to have a tutorial play simultaneously with their first few rounds of the game backfires as things start to go downhill almost right away, with the players initially confounded on what to do to remedy this. This nearly complete breakdown in comprehension of the rules during a game forces players to pass the book of scripts about in a mad dash to search for answers. Before explaining this game, one must understand its level of difficulty. It's high. Extremely. So much so that I spent the previous 4,000 words of this video dismissing its established difficulty as the artistic choice of a board game willing to do what its video game was too scared to take on. But that doesn't change the fact that this game is brutal. And not like Pandemic is brutal until you figure out how to win the game and develop a strategy to turn your 80-20 loss to an 80-20 win ratio. I mean brutal in a way that you can do everything right, follow a proven strategy someone claims is reliable, and be pushed utterly into the dirt in such swiftness as to make you question your understanding of the rules. And once again, in real life, war is rarely fair. In a game trying to convey the chaos of war, the reality of hopelessness, and force players to face an inevitable fate while wrapped in gameplay mechanics you insist must have a solution, then mission accomplished. It can be interpreted as educational, something a teacher would whip out during a lecture and force his or her students to endure, but one where the needs of enlightenment exceed those for enjoyment or fairness. You start the rules with the journal, and as you probably figured out by now, players do not control specific characters, a decision rooted solely to enable the capacity for character death without player elimination. Regardless of player count, draw 3 characters, followed by a level 2 hunger token. Characters by default can take 3 actions a day. These tokens limit that number. The token with the least amount of available actions dictates the number of actions you can take. So here, from the onset, characters are crippled. In comparison to the video game, one of many you'll notice me making, although characters can be stricken with hunger or illness from the start until it worsens and then worsens again, these conditions in no way affect a character's abilities. Place all the matching miniatures on the unused space. Then distribute the, I kid you not, more than 16 different sets of cards across the board, including the fitting cards, night raid cards, resident cards, 3 location cards, and all the shelter cards. Compose the event deck by stacking 3 shuffled ending event cards, the Chapter 3 card, 4 event cards with the Chapter 2 card, 3 event cards topping with the Chapter 1 card. Add a lockpick, a shovel, 4 components, 4 wood, 2 water, and 3 raw food to the supply. The concept of the journal and the hand-holding tutorial is novel, but unlike another game that succeeds at this, Bog of Love, this War of Mine utterly failed in its attempt. For one, the journal is far too abrupt, but in desperation to keep it under 15 pages, I had to count, apparently Poland doesn't think page numbers should be a thing, the designers threw all the detailed rules and FAQs scattered throughout the entries in the Book of Scripts. And yes, despite what the game thinks, if you want a snowball's chance of surviving your first game, which is still doubtful, you will have to read these. And these FAQ references are scattered like buckshot across the manual, so much so that I honestly missed most of them on my first pass. And to make matters worse, there are even hidden advanced rules you have to search for. The player holding the script book is the leader and assumes unilateral control of the decisions made that turn. To prove the characters are squatting, just like the video game, large portions of the house are inaccessible, resulting in time wasted in scavenging from one's own home. A turn starts in the morning, paralleling the game. Draw the top card, which in this case would be the Chapter 1 card, which itself dictates the drawing of objectives. The final objective is always the same: survive, with a bizarre stipulation that at least one starting character must survive with at least state equal or less than 2, conditions the video game doesn't bother to impose. Complete the current objectives before the chapter is concluded, and reap the benefits or suffer the consequences. Another invention of the board game. Anytime you find a hand symbol, that is a location where you can place a miniature and carry out that action, assuming you possess the requirements to do so. These can include shelter spaces to scavenge or fittings for craftings. If you need to pick a lockpick, roll a black die. 1 to 3, that action is wasted. Any other result, discard the lockpick, flip the card over, and gain the resources. And as you might have figured out, there is no die rolling in the video game. The lockpick always works. The fittings match those from the video game, though there is a strange and somewhat arbitrary block from gaining more than the starting 10, while in the video game it's more of a logical tree branch progression. To make a fitting, place the card down, place the character, spend the supplies if you have them, then flip the card over. After all the characters have taken their available actions, dusk occurs. Each character must consume 1 water and 1 type of food. The better the food, the more hunger resolved. Otherwise, suffer from hunger or misery. If you lack food or water, the character could suddenly starve to death in apparently 2 days. This conceit is an obvious one, as the video game would encompass 8 to 12 hours, with the game taking between 25 and 65 days. The board game limits this to a still incredibly long but condensed 13 days and 3 to 5 hours. Despite this, it still comes off as absurd, compounded by the obvious fact that the number of resources you can possess are limited by the tokens in the game, a restriction the video game doesn't impose. So canned food is limited to only 3. The video game also ignores water requirements and counts generic food as including both. The dusk phase involves determining who is sleeping on the floor, on the bed, who is on guard duty, and who is scavenging. Unlike the video game, up to 3 characters can scavenge. Necessary, since unlike the video game, a single character in the board game is apparently limited to carrying 3 bottles of water before they collapse from exhaustion. I'm actually not joking, that's how restrictive a character's carrying capacity can be. Scavenging is entirely card-based. Draw exploration cards as shown on the location space, then resolve them one after another. Each one will offer choices or challenges, many referring to the Book of Scripts. Actions generate noise and specific cards will force a roll. Roll under the noise value and a resident will appear. With the video game, the appearance of civilians is entirely predictable. The supermarket always has 2 different residents, and once you deal with them, in whatever fashion you see fit, they don't reappear. But in the board game, it is completely random. When the unknown deck is depleted, you can add as much wood, water, and components to fill up your supplies. Then the characters return to the house, and the night raid phase begins. Draw and resolve the top card of the night raid deck. In the video game, a raid would generally occur every 2 nights. With the board game, only 2 cards of 10 don't result in a raid. This eventually leads to a random roll depending on the type of weapon. In the video game, eventually, with enough defenses, night raids become inconsequential, but in the board game, a single bad roll can always spell disaster. After the night phase, a new dawn rises. The scavenging party returns, you can assign meds and bandages, you must then draw a fate card, which resolves injured or sick characters. There are other inconsistencies between the video game and the board game. In the video game, the trader would show up every 2 or 3 days, but in the board game, he rarely shows up. The video game gives you numerous choices of locations to visit, with a relatively predictable set of problems once you arrive there. But in the board game, you can only select one of 3. Additionally, the video game offers several safe locations devoid of residents, while others have predictable residents telegraphed through the selection screen. In the board game, every location, even the quiet house, can suddenly spawn soldiers. It's completely indiscriminate. There's no pattern. Admittedly, the video game becomes predictable. You arrive at the supermarket, you kill a soldier that's about to assault a woman. That location becomes safe afterward. So you return often. But in the board game, you can arrive at the abandoned cottage one night, kill some thugs, return the next day, only to find them there again. There had to have been a better way to have handled the scavenging phase than this. Yes, I know, complete chaos is thematically consistent, but even the video game knew not everything should be up to chance. The Book of Scripts has its strengths, but its constant inclusion becomes tedious after a while. The video game made reading journals and story segments optional, but here you have no choice. There is a lot to love about what the board game is trying to accomplish. And although it took effort to increase its sense of realism over the video game, in order to truncate a still prolonged running length, it laid down unrealistic rules regarding carrying capacity and how debilitating characters are after suffering from the various conditions in the game. The board game is also unforgivingly random, and not just with minor variables, but immediately consequential events that suddenly end the game. Imagine having a good day, acquiring needed food, and then rats eat it all. That's it. Reveal this card at the wrong time, and your deaths are nearly guaranteed. No skill check to avoid, nothing players could do to prevent it. Draw a card, lose the game. While the digital variant implies the characters are robust, strong-willed, and steadfast, the analog portrays them as fragile, depressive, and borderline incompetent. Every character is apparently 3 days from suicide, and I have to believe that was intentional, to walk down a path the video game was unwilling to tread. I must think that, unless I embrace the idea that the board game suffers from a narcissistic game designer who refused to heed the warning from playtesters insisting they took an already somber and challenging video game and made it so considerably darker and more difficult as to make playing it a slog. There is evidence that the board game is flawed. The manual is a mess. Much of the mechanics are clunky in their application. The biggest issue is that players don't control specific characters, and there is no action involving multiple players working together. This War of Mine is effectively a solitaire game. Each round is played by one person, with the other player simply stepping aside, limited to only advice. There's also very useful but an equally annoying app. The app adds another function to the scavenging phase, a timer, a throwback to the video game, but it also adds a noise meter. Literally, the players must remain as quiet as possible as their characters search the location. If they make too much noise, regardless of where the noise counter is, it must be rolled. The timer is set for 180 seconds, but if you complete a scavenging phase before the end, you will be rewarded with additional loot. The microphone is entirely optional and can be turned off. Also, there's a lockpicking minigame to replace the die, and I'll just admit that I despise this. It's entirely reflex-based, involving timing 5 pins perfectly, and if you screw up once, the whole thing repeats. It's inane and amateurish. While the timer adds bonuses and speeds up gameplay, the lockpick lengthens the game with a needless mechanic the video game was smart enough to not implement. However, the app does have the complete script book, but a strange deadness in selecting options can grow frustrating. The ambient music is a nice touch, though. Throughout all of this, I have been focusing on what is assumed to be the standard method of play, the base game you're introduced to. I find it interesting that the easier games are in variations offered after the fact. If it truly wants your first experience to be negative, unpleasant, and only after does it gild itself in a silver lining that, hey, you want an easier variation? This is of course ignoring the fact that this is not a digital video game, and modifying the mechanics through homebrew is an easy affair. You don't have to cheese some loophole or be forced to repeat the day or employ some cracked workaround from cheathappens.com. Players could all simply accept homebrew rules to make winning the game easier, and that could be the only time the game's unflinching approach to its artistic vision becomes compromised. At least the video game possesses some measure of control. But unless you're playing in a controlled environment, like if the game was actually being played at a social event or an art exhibit, or more plausibly at a convention where the game owner was a stranger, a group of friends around a table could unanimously agree to nerf the board game as they saw fit, to alter reality in ways the gods these characters probably worshipped hoped they would. Irony. As players, you control choices and deal with the consequences, but are still bound by the rules of a reality put forth by a greater order, the game's creator. A reality and an order that would act callous and apathetic to the pains of those affected by said rules, despite the pleas for emancipation from such a merciless system, but one where those with lesser power, the players, could easily and without repercussions alter the fabric of time and space to ensure survivability. Players may not be demigods or theistic entities, but just manifestations of powerful international entities able to step in and fix the problems, but don't. Not unless they break from the limitations that may be imposed by their own insistence on following the rules. Maybe, just maybe, the game wants us to break the rules, to act as the greater power, to step in to save people from a system that would destroy them. Would we then look to the real world and wonder, could we do the same? Could we intervene? Of course we could. But do we? Many of us don't. This war of mine not only places us in control of the actions of civilians in wartime, but also in the metaphorical sense of the means to alter the very world around it, to alter the rules to make survival easier. Of course, maybe I'm just spouting that off to make myself feel better. Justification to ensure a game could actually be enjoyable, or at least one that I enjoy. For one, I'd actually allow players to select whichever characters they want rather than have it random. That's an easy start. Fate cards could impose a roll to make characters worse, 1 to 5 to remain stable, 6 to 10 to make it worse. The same goes for negative effects found in the spirit entries on cards. The video game offers a possibility for a quiet night. Instead of always drawing a night raid, roll before, 1 to 5 for a quiet night, 6 to 10 to draw a night raid card. Additionally, I wouldn't have misery negatively affect the number of available actions until reaching level 4, and I'll explain why in about 300 words. There is another aspect, a deeper flaw the game is ignoring, altogether a basic thematic and ideological disagreement. One of the common fates for characters in this war of mine involves an emotional breakdown, leading to severe depression and eventual suicide. I've had people abandon me in the video game, but no one has ever killed themselves. And that moment of abandonment I spoke of earlier, well, they didn't die. The epilogue revealed that they survived the war as well. But the board game brings to light the unfortunate connection between war and suicide, but then makes the wrong conclusion. With the book of scripts, there are around 50 entries regarding the removal of characters from the game, although a handful involve the aforementioned walk out into the dark street to perhaps never be seen again. A large number involves the character's ultimate madness. They slit their wrists, they eat a bullet, or strangle themselves, displaying the body for their friends to later find and suffer from. The problem stems from statistics that show suicide rates dropping during times of war. An aspect of human nature. People have a tendency of banding together, of working towards a common goal, and by a general rule are unlikely to commit acts of selfish as suicide, especially in the presence of others. It's a statistical anomaly, which honestly pops up more times than it should. Moreover, those who already suffer from severe depression tend to act more calmly than others under heavy pressure, because they already expect bad things to happen. Let's be absolutely clear, misery is a core issue plaguing these characters, while in the video game, it is only a minor concern. Case in point, Amelia is addicted to coffee, and for each day without one, her misery increases by 1. That means if this problem is not mitigated, after at most 4 days, Amelia will kill herself. 4 days without a cup of coffee, and this character commits suicide. And in case you're wondering, in all my time playing the video game, I never had coffee, and no character became suicidal given its absence. And she wasn't the only one. Erica and Bruno's misery will drop unless they have a cigarette. Anton requires books, and if he reads one, his misery is reduced, but his fatigue goes up. I'm not sure what he's reading, but I've never been winded tackling Shakespeare. I don't know, must be the Silmarillion. And I admit probably suffering from an addiction to caffeine, but lacking it for 3 days probably won't result in me slicing my wrists with a lit can of beans. This war of mine takes inspiration from recent conflicts, but then cherry-picks that inspiration to create a situation devoid of any real emotional weight. The country is fictitious. One of the locations you can raid is a church, an oddity considering religion is never mentioned once during the game, likewise the motivations for this conflict. For this war of mine, the war is an act of God. It's nameless, a random force unexplained, even though for the characters in the game, it is absolutely defined. They know the conflict. We do not. As a result, both versions of the game take the safe road by avoiding subjects like rape, genocide, and slavery. We never know the culture of this functional nation, if it has one worth saving. But the realities of war are so distant, so much on the fringes of the game's theme, that it could easily have been an alien invasion or a zombie apocalypse. It's so much a detachment that if swapping a real war with a paranormal one, the game wouldn't change. And that feels like a flaw both games suffer from. The needs of being a game became paramount, which is why filling out paperwork and standing in line for 6 hours for food rations is not a game component. We, or at least I, forgave the video game for these failings because the survival elements were still enjoyable. But with the board game lacking that satisfaction, it forces me to analyze its artistic expression and how it still took the easy way out regarding the subject matter's truly darker elements. This war of mine paints a picture of war, but it uses language of games to do so, was one quote from the designer. The game does not need to include every single atrocity of war invented by men to deliver its message. This indicates that the designers felt that gamers were not mature enough, not ready to deal with that level of darkness. A weird irony given that murder and suicide are apparently fully acceptable. The board game is recommended for people 18 years and up, so why hold back? Why censor the language or the content? Both versions of the game wanted to express horrid lives of people living as collateral in war. And the video game took the lead by filtering that content and presenting a conflict and situation that could not actually exist as depicted. But as said, still a fun game. The board game doesn't benefit from this luxury, leaving it to just be judged as an overtly difficult experience that arbitrarily made decisions regarding the challenges and traumas facing unrealistic people in unrealistic war. It's easy to become art at that point because, like the video game, it is making significant concessions. The board game had a choice: pull back its difficulty and dark storytelling to make the game easier, more accessible, like its predecessor, or take a chance in creating the experience the digital variation didn't have the courage to tell. Falling somewhere in between, it fails in both respects. This War of Mine, the board game, despite taking more risks, still fails to impart an accurate depiction of civilian life in a war-torn city. I suppose I should give it credit for trying, but the unrelenting randomness and difficulty does point to it being more an artistic piece than an actual game. But an artistic piece created by artists that wanted to show one atrocity while filtering out another. I suppose it does have merit, it can be considered artistic, but I wait the day when a game can be made that refuses to yield and crosses that threshold into being true art. If you want an enjoyable survival experience, you'll need to homebrew it, or just play Robinson Crusoe. If you want a brutally harrowing experience, this war of mine tries to fill that slot, but then concedes at the knife edge before stepping into truly horrific and realistic storytelling. It examined what the video game got right and got wrong, but then came to incorrect conclusions on how to improve the design. How to solve non-existent problems and work around obstacles that only they believed were present, while at the same time leaving glaring errors and masking them as artistic discretion. I don't hate this game. I can't. It tried harder than most. It set its goal line almost an unrealistic distance away. It failed, but it gets credit for pushing further while other games accepted thoughtlessness. It needs to exist for better games to come later and stand upon the foundations set here. This is Chris from Deus Ex Machina.